A certain very vocal subset of Christians are all about enforcing gender norms today, but have you ever wondered if that was always the case? This topic came up in a talk I gave back in April about sex and gender in the ancient biblical world. Now, part one looked at how ancient people understood gender. I'll link to that in the description in case you want to check that out first. And part two checked out how the gods could violate gender norms without losing any honor. Here in part three, we'll look at evidence that early Christians subverted gender norms. Men identifying as brides, women leaders, non-binary bodies,
dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
So let's ask a few critical questions in this episode of Sounds Like BS, Early Christian Gender Subversions.
To end things, I want to look at cases in the Christian New Testament where religious believers subverted ancient gender expectations, maybe in part because they believed they had become God's children, so should be in some sense like God, including God's androgyny or at least God's freedom to break gender norms. My point is not to claim that early Christian groups always violated gender norms, but because body, behavior, and identity were mutually influential in the ancient world, how one identifies and behaves become very important. Someone who presented themselves in a non-normative way, or whose behavior violated gender norms, was a genuine threat to the system of gender restrictions guiding ancient societies. So when New Testament texts push the boundaries of gender norms in all three categories, we might see more than impotent metaphors. Let's begin with gender identity. Here you'll notice the examples I'm using are more identifying with than identifying as. We'll get to some stronger cases of cross-gendering in a bit. In Hebrew religious texts, the God Yahweh identifies with a mother eagle protecting her young. In the New Testament, Jesus, who claims to be God's son, femmes the image even more by identifying with a mother hen when he says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones the ones who were sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings." Jesus contrasts himself in one text with the ruler Herod, whom he calls a fox, in another text with the scribes and Pharisees, whom he calls snakes. Both animals feed on chickens, so it would also make sense to focus on the male rooster fighting these attackers, or at least sounding the alarm, since he is, after all, sounding the alarm himself. But in these texts, Jesus chooses for himself the feminine, and in this case, more vulnerable image of a hen gathering her chicks. He identifies with the mother over the father in that situation. Meanwhile, the Apostle Paul describes himself and his followers, many of them men, in very motherly terms. "My children, for whom I labor again," not work, but labor as in childbirth, "until Christ is formed in you." Paul puts himself in the place of a birthing mother and his followers in the less mature position of a pregnant woman in the first trimester, since formation is an early stage of gestation in Greek biology, basically the point at which the fetus became recognizably humanoid. The image is of a man, Paul, giving birth to believers who are women and men gestating Christ like an embryo. In other words, Paul feminizes himself and all of his readers, men and women. And he does this in a letter he writes to combat pressure for Galatian men to get circumcised before they can become full members of the church. Pun intended. Since girls were not circumcised, only boys, the surgery inherently discriminated between boys and girls, giving men a special ritual while excluding women. Paul combats this move toward privileging men followers by using feminine imagery. In the same letter, after all, Paul says that in Christ there is no male and female. If not, circumcision is no longer such a primary issue. By the way, one ancient justification for circumcision was that it was a sort of primitive gender affirmation surgery. So in ancient biology, men essentially had the same genitals as women. The foreskin was seen as traces of the female labia majora that hadn't been shed in the womb. So removing the foreskin effectively made the boys' genitals more masculine. Now we'll return to more explicit transgender identification in a religious setting in a moment, but so far, maybe these are just patterns of metaphors and not suggestive of a deeper identification. As long as early Christian men acted like men and women acted like ladies, except that wasn't always the case. In one text, in his last meal, Jesus leaves his place of honor at the table, strips off his clothes, and washes his disciples' feet, much like on 2 previous occasions women had washed his feet. The disciple Peter, there he is again, strongly objects to this. So what's Peter's problem? Washing feet is a humble act, yes, but it's important to understand why. It would usually be done by a woman, and often enough by an enslaved woman. Washing feet was so humiliating that enslaved Jewish men could refuse to do it. It was one of 3 acts they could refuse to do, but not Jewish women. Enslaved Jewish women had to wash their stinky feet whether they liked it or not. And Jesus is, after all, Jewish. Peter objects because Jesus humiliates himself by acting like a woman of the lowest station. Then Jesus tells his disciples he wants them to act like women. If I washed your feet, the Lord and the teacher, then you too should wash each other's feet, since I gave you a model of behavior, so that just as I did to you, you should do as well. Jesus acts like a woman with no status and then tells his disciples that they, all men as far as we know, should be willing to renounce their gendered status and find honor in the service offered by the least valued in their society, to identify with enslaved women by acting like them. He completely undermines the Greco-Roman goal in imposing gender norms by overturning social hierarchies among his followers. Jesus also encourages women to act rather mannishly. The women in the Gospels speak and act boldly in public spaces, men's spaces, rather than being silently hidden away in the home. This portrayal of women followers of Jesus is backed up by early evidence showing Christian women leading churches, traveling as missionaries, or using their wealth to provide financial support. So it's not just that Jesus encouraged men to identify with women and find value in feminine gender roles, but women also were encouraged to identify themselves in Christ, a man, and to behave like men in public. Early Christians evidently weren't afraid to question masculine and feminine gender roles in the cultural context of their time, and sometimes to embrace subversive gender behavior. But did early Christians at least share modern binary attitudes toward gendered bodies? Or are there signs that early Christians accepted or even celebrated bodies that didn't conform to gender expectations? Let's begin with an episode in the Acts of the Apostles, which is a sort of short history of the early Jesus movement found in Christian Bibles. Here, one of the principal church leaders, a man named Philip, recruits an Ethiopian eunuch. Eunuchs were men who were castrated, at least the testicles removed, sometimes a penis too. Since the eunuch in Acts is treasurer to the queen of Ethiopia, it's likely he was castrated to allow close, private access to the queen without the risk of pregnancy. They needed someone who could pass between men's spaces and women's spaces without causing disorder.
Can I? How many times have I seen a man? A real man? All I've seen is you.
In all cases, men who were castrated were unmanned, feminized, and made androgynous. Just as today cis people sort of obsess over transgender people's genitals.
The medication still your private parts are different now, aren't they? I don't want to talk about it because it's really personal.
Removing male genitals confirmed for ancient people that this person was no longer a man, although not quite a woman. Eunuchs sat in a liminal place in between men and women, both socially and legally. Under Roman law, castrated citizens lost the legal right to marry. In Jewish society, they were forbidden from joining God's assembly. In popular thought, they were often vilified and outcast. Most doors were closed to eunuchs because they violated gender norms in their bodies, behavior, and identity. Yet in the book of Acts, Philip doesn't just happen upon the eunuch. A high-ranking church leader and an angel, a heavenly creature, go out of their way to recruit a non-binary person who would be excluded under the Torah and despised according to the gender norms of the day. This is in line with Jesus' teaching as reported in the Gospel of Matthew, since there he encourages disciples not to get remarried after divorce by holding eunuchs up as an example to follow. There are eunuchs who were born from their mother's womb like this, and there are eunuchs who have been castrated by people, and there are eunuchs who have castrated themselves for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Whoever can receive this should receive this. Jesus recognizes and validates intersex people, those born from their mother's womb like this, but also non-binary castrati. That is, Jesus goes directly against the moral and legal judgments of the day by encouraging his cisgender disciples to be more like those intersex and proto-transgender folks.
Okay, let me break in really quick to highlight that the eunuch is reading a scroll of the prophet Isaiah when Philip finds him. Now, he's reading from a different chapter, but there is a passage in Isaiah where it reads, "Do not let the eunuchs join the Yahweh say, I am just a dry tree. For thus says Yahweh, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast to my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that will not be cut off." Get it? Cut off. Isaiah imagines a future where Yahweh welcomes foreigners and eunuchs, and Acts is basically one long story about how the early church started to welcome foreigners. So this long passage about them welcoming a eunuch may serve to suggest that the messianic future envisioned in Isaiah is now coming true.
There may be good reason for that. After all, there are non-binary bodily images of Jesus in the New Testament too. In the book of Revelation, the seer John has a vision of the risen Christ wearing a golden sash across his chest, according to most English translations. But the original Greek doesn't say his chest, but his mastois, his breasts. Mastoi, a root of our word mastectomy, explicitly refers to women, to breasts' capacity to give milk, or to their round shape. In other words, in Revelation, the glorified Christ has boobs. Jesus' androgynous divine father acts as a mother to believers on occasion, so in some sense, Christ's breasts are like the other strange images in the vision, eyes like flames, holding stars in your hand. Jesus' anatomical androgyny communicates his divinity. The gods can be androgynous, and the writer of Revelation thinks of Christ as God. If Christ nurses, there must have been a birth. And according to Christian traditions, going back at least to the Middle Ages, that birth is depicted at the crucifixion in the Gospel of John. After Jesus dies on the cross, the soldiers make sure he's dead by stabbing his side with a spear. That is, they penetrate him with a long phallic object. Remember, in first century culture, men penetrate, women are penetrated. But then a strange thing happens. Immediately, blood and water came out. Now, water really shouldn't be coming out. In fact, since he's already dead, not much blood should be coming out. It should be pooling at his feet by now. The flow of blood and water is so strange that the narrator breaks in to say, "The one who saw this has testified so that you also may believe. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth." Like, geez, dude, we get it. So it's a weird biological event that John draws extra attention to. But what could it mean? There's another event associated with blood and a sudden flow of water, childbirth. It's almost like Jesus is penetrated, then symbolically gives birth to someone, but who? According to Carolyn Walker Bynum, medieval Christians had an answer. Jesus gives birth to the church. In some cases, they depicted the church as a woman emerging from the hole in Jesus' side. In others, they depicted the stab wound resembling a vulva. Jesus not only has a penetrable body like a woman, his body is excessively moist, as Greeks perceived women's bodies to be. So moist that he mimics the flow of blood and water associated with giving birth to a child. Then, according to Revelation, after his resurrection, he grows breasts, another sign of excessive moisture according to Greek biology. We don't hear much about Jesus' body in the New Testament. We never hear he had a beard or long hair or anything like that. The few images we have are distinctly divine and, as it turns out, quite feminine from a first century perspective. Now, I teased a more explicit transgendering of identity in the New Testament, which also appears in Revelation. Toward the end of Revelation, Jesus marries the church as his bride. A bride, the text tells us, made up of 144,000 men, virgins like Artemis or Mary, who assume the image of a bride and marry Christ. The seer John imagines himself symbolically in a straight relationship with Jesus, but just one in which he identifies himself as the woman. In a later text not in Bibles, becoming brides to Christ is again literalized in the story of the martyrs Sergius and Bacchus, Roman soldiers who are dressed as brides to humiliate them after they convert to Christianity. but who instead claim Jesus, quote, has covered us with the robe of righteousness. You have dressed us with women's gowns as bride and joined us to you. In the Gospel of John, Jesus can act as son and as mother. In Revelation, Christ can act as mother and husband. For early Christians, any positive image for Christ was fair game, whether it was masculine or feminine. Depicting Christ in strictly masculine terms, as some modern binary Christians want to do, evidently wasn't always a priority for the early church. These gender subversions, especially in behavior, were obvious to outsiders and impacted how they viewed the growing Christian movement under Roman power. The Roman governor Pliny writes to Emperor Trajan to ask how to deal with Christians only after arresting 2 Christian ministers who happened to be enslaved women. The women's lack of status with outsiders contrasted strongly with their inside religious status as leaders and teachers, upending Roman social values. That had to be dealt with. The writer Lucius Apuleius is horrified by the strong role of Christian women and slanders them as whorish, greedy liars because he simply cannot understand why men would listen to women. Celsus, meanwhile, attacks Christian men as gullible, stupid, and immature for trusting women teachers. The orator Fronto speculates about Christians' secret Sunday meetings. Romans kept men and women in strictly separate social spaces, particularly if eating and drinking were involved. I mean, you're putting things in your mouth. Yet Christians invited women to attend a Sunday meal with men who were not their family. The only thing Fronto can imagine happening at Sunday church is a massive sex orgy. In the opposite camp, the medical writer Galen admires Christian women's ability to remain celibate, even comparing them to the philosophers, but contextually suggests that in doing so, they've lost all personal and physical femininity, effectively becoming men by acting like men. Remember Thomas, every woman who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. The Roman neighbors of early Christians noticed their gender-subversive behavior, and they looked down on them for it. They mocked Christians for not sticking to gender roles, and occasionally used their gender subversion as justification to arrest and even execute church members. Notably, over time, mainline church leaders brought Christian behavior more in line with established Roman gender values. Women stopped leading churches or going on missions, men took up positions of greater power, and theologians developed a thoroughly masculine understanding of God. In many ways, Christians assimilated to ancient Mediterranean cultures regarding gender, but echoes of their early willingness to challenge gender norms are still heard in the texts from the first 2 centuries of Christianity. What we've seen today is that ancient people understood sex and gender very differently than any of us do now. They had strong binary gender norms on behavior, but that was in part because they were not as firmly binary in their understanding of sex and gender as many people are today. They didn't live in a binary world, they were trying to create one. Yet the gods and other spiritual creatures like angels, we didn't have time to go over the angels, were free to be androgynous, to be gender fluid or gender ambiguous because they were divine. Gender fluidity in the spiritual realm simply didn't create the problems they perceived in the physical world. For whatever reason, some early Christians were less concerned with keeping the gender norms of their day, breaking down barriers between women's spaces and men's, encouraging men to serve and women to lead, inviting people in who had non-binary bodies, and allowing men to identify as Christ's bride. These gender subversions were not universal, but they are still evident. They also caused trouble for Christians with their Roman neighbors, who felt strongly that men and women should know their place. But if Christians continued to subvert Roman gender norms even in the face of persecution, it's all the more reason to pay attention to this distinct aspect of early Christianity. Thank you.